individuals concerned. The big landowners don't want to lose their labour supply, so they use all forms of influence and graft and everything to keep the recruiting officers off their estates.
For many Roman citizens, it wasn't just the desire to avoid conscription. There was a feeling that they might be better off if the barbarians did take control.
There was a general disaffection and an unwillingness of people to serve in the army, and frankly, less and less interest in the survival of the Western Empire. People were often quite happy to live under the rule of a Germanic prince because he was perhaps more capable of defending them, and also the taxes were probably lower. So the empire consequently fell apart.
The Western Empire was declining the fastest. And in the year 395 AD, the unofficial split between East and West became official, with the West and the wealthier East ruled by separate emperors. This move hastened the decline of the West by lowering its ability to defend itself.
The late 390s, the Eastern Emperor effectively managed to steal a large number of the Western Army's best regiments to replace many of those, I guess, that were lost at Adrianople. And this left the West really very vulnerable thereafter.
Also in 395 AD, the Goths living inside the empire revolted under their leader, Alaric. They raided Greece, then moved north and raided northern Italy. About the same time, other Germanic invaders, including the Vandals, poured across the Rhine, sacking the city of Trier and sweeping into Gaul. In 410 AD, Alaric and his Goths sacked Rome, something that hadn't happened for 800 years. The Goths then left Italy and created their own kingdom in southern France. Other Germanic tribes took over large parts of Spain, and the Vandals captured North Africa, including Carthage. Britain was surrendered in the year 410 AD, with the emperor telling Britons they'd have to defend themselves. By the mid-400s AD, the Western Empire was on the verge of collapse. The Western Roman army, disunited, outnumbered, and underfinanced, had no real chance of holding off the threat, especially as they had helped train the invaders in the past by recruiting them into the Roman army.
And these people come over, serve under Roman orders, but then very often they take off back again. And therefore they've learned a lot, not only about techniques and so on, but I mean actual military intelligence. They know where to attack if they come back on the other side. The big example is Alaric. Alaric the Visigoth, the chap who actually captures Rome in 410. He had been off and on serving under Roman orders for a good many years before he does this.
Despite their name, Barbarians, the invaders were not out to destroy the empire. On the contrary, many wanted to live the Roman lifestyle.
Everywhere, the wealth of Rome is acting like a magnet, and the barbarian groups across the frontier are organizing themselves to start preying on that wealth. The Roman Empire has created a rich territory, and the barbarians, like the mafia in the 1920s and 30s, are organizing to exploit it.
In fact, the Romans and their invaders were still prepared to join together to fight a common threat. In the mid-400s AD, that threat was Attila the Hun. The Huns had already created their own empire in Germany and began making raids into both Roman empires, east and west.
The roads are truly ferocious. They go all the way from the gates of Constantinople, Istanbul, as now is the gates of Paris, east to west, and also to Milan in northern Italy.
The Huns' policy was to destroy all in their wake. The Chinese had built their Great Wall to keep them out. The Huns were brilliant horsemen who could fire long-distance arrows while at a full gallop. To slow the Huns' advance, the Romans had to rely on other barbarian warriors already within the empire. In 451 AD, on the fields of the Champagne district, Attila's army was met by a so-called Roman army made up of Romans, Burgundians, Franks and Goths, who fought Attila to a standstill.
The 5th century is actually about one group of barbarians fighting another group. Sometimes we call them Romans, sometimes we call them Goths and Vandals. In a sense, we lose sight of a force that can be clearly labelled Roman. So to talk about the defeat of the Roman army, in a sense, is to make this process more clear-cut than it actually was.
Attila then raided Italy, but was bribed to leave. And after he died in 453 AD, the Huns lost their unity and were overthrown by their own subjects in Germany. The Western Roman Empire suffered much the same fate. Throughout the 400s AD, it had been turning into a mosaic of German kingdoms, and Italy itself became the final domino to fall. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman Emperor, Romulus Augustus, was forced by the Goths to abdicate. The Western Empire was gone, but the Roman army and its influence were not. History speaks of the fall of the Roman Empire, but the Western Empire didn't really fall. Rather, it was transformed by gradual assimilation, with the Romans and barbarians becoming more and more like each other.
Look, it's just much less exciting, I know, to think of accommodation and assimilation. It's much better to think of hairy barbarian hordes charging across frontiers. But I think it's unlikely that it happened that way. I'd go for a much slower process in which by the 5th century, actually in Gaul and parts of northern Italy, it's difficult to spot the difference between a Roman and a barbarian.
One reason is that in most cases, the invaders kept things much the same. They lived Roman lifestyles, preserved Christianity, and used Roman citizens to run the affairs of state.
Barbarians certainly enjoyed Roman civilization. There's a tremendous amount of evidence to that effect. When the Vandals get to North Africa, they start to wear togas, hang about in the baths and go to circuses, build themselves villas and decorate them with Roman-style mosaics, portraying themselves as Roman aristocrats.
As for the Roman army in the West, it was never officially disbanded. As the empire fell apart, many legions simply stopped receiving their pay, and they melted back into the local population. That's what seems to have happened at Hadrian's Wall.
The coinage has just about disappeared, and therefore one has to speculate, based on evidence of what we know about from other provinces elsewhere. And here, certainly my view is still the one that they gradually fade away.
Although the Western Roman Empire and its army disappeared, the Eastern Empire and its army continued to flourish. The Eastern Empire, known today as Byzantium, had always been the wealthier half, and its borders were less vulnerable to attack.
The East's major military antagonist was the Persian Empire, with which the Eastern Empire had very serious wars, but at least they could achieve treaties with the Persian king, and this could bring long periods of peace. So it was actually perhaps a rather easier task for the East to defend itself than for the West.
Although the look of the Eastern army gradually changed, at its core, it was still run along the same fundamental lines as Roman armies of the past.
It maintained in the long term standing regiments. It also maintained the disciplinary system, the command structure, the logistical system, and so on. It was the professional nature of the Roman army which lasted, at least for some centuries, into the Byzantine period.
In fact, in the 500s AD, the Eastern army briefly reclaimed several provinces of the old Western Empire, including Italy and northern Africa. Although it gradually changed, this army maintained Roman discipline and tactics until the Byzantine Empire was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453.
That's a continuation of those tactics all the way through, I think, to the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. The old Roman army is key to the maintenance of the empire in the East for another 1,000 years.
The Roman army, in its changing forms, can be said to have won and protected empires for some 2,000 years, from the 5th century BC to the 15th century AD. At its height, it was so efficient that it ruled with a standing force that seems almost tiny by modern standards, about 400,000 men.
Louis XIV ruled his rich kingdom, which was nonetheless simply one province of the old Roman Empire, with as large a standing army as the Romans had required to control this vast area from Scotland to the Sahara Desert, to Iraq, to the Black Sea. That is a staggering feat.
The Roman army changed warfare forever. It was the first truly professional army, and it introduced concepts of discipline and training that still influence armies today.
Its great military successes have always been famous. The name of Julius Caesar has never really been forgotten. Consequently, it formed the obvious model for the armies of the modern nation-states of the West in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. Many of our own military traditions are based on at least the way our generals have imagined Rome once was.
If Julius Caesar and the other great Roman generals could see a modern army, they'd recognize many similarities, such as discipline, command structure, and logistics. But they'd also notice a big difference. The Roman army at its height was more ruthless with defeated enemies.
If the great Roman generals had been running campaigns in Vietnam, if they'd been running Desert Storm, then we need have no doubt at all that Hanoi would have been captured and razed, that Baghdad would have been flattened, its inhabitants slaughtered, any survivors sold into slavery. We like to think of the Romans as civilized, and partly that's true, but the Roman Empire has a hard edge, and that's the hard edge of conquest and of brutality. In front of the Roman war machine lies conquest and blood.
Because of that paradoxical mix of ruthless conquest and the spread of civilization, the Roman army's legacy to us today goes far beyond military matters. Much of Western culture is based on the civilization that the Roman army took with it as it colonized Europe. Many Western languages, including French, Spanish, and Italian, are based on the Romans' own language of Latin. Also, Western architecture, coinage, art, and law, indeed so much of our modern life, can be traced to the spread of the Roman Empire. And that empire was the creation of the Roman army. There would not have been an empire without it.